Good morning. Path of Fearlessness, the Fearlessness Movement, the Fearlessness Project. These are all large terms, historical terms, as you can hear. I'm talking about movements, I'm talking about revolutions. These are things this morning that I'll touch on, but the fundamental purpose of today is to do, and I'm excited to introduce a book to you, just published recently this late fall, in October, I believe, and it's by a woman, a writer. As far as I know, she's queer as well, may identify herself in many and diverse dynamic identities as queer. And her name is Lucile Scott, a journalist from Brooklyn, and we'll introduce her as we go. So most important is the connection of this book to my interests, and that's what I'll bring out. I'm going to do a small PowerPoint presentation to introduce this topic in the book and do some reading from the book, a few highlights I've picked out. Haven't finished the book, to be honest, so there's a little transparency. Read about 100 pages. My wife and I get together in the evenings often, and when we just sit down and light a candle or just sit down and rest and want to read to each other. A lovely relationship building thing that we've been doing for years. And both of us are interested in this book and the topic of it, which you're going to hear about very shortly. I want to say that you're going to hear also about me. It's hard for me to talk about historical figures or movements or politics or evolution, which I'm interested in all these things, just like with Lucile Scott in her book. She also writes about herself and her journey. So that's what I'm talking about. Not myself as because I'm so wonderful and interesting, but myself because I am a reflection of the I in the cosmos, in that relationship, the micro in the macro. Within the macro is the micro. This is a mystical statement, you could say. This is a spiritual statement of claim of the interrelationship of all life, right? And so I'm an ecological thinker, but I'm also a spiritual thinker. And oh, you didn't know that? Well, oh, you may have known that. That's why I'm doing the video as well. The sub-narrative of the video is to introduce you to the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly. A period of my life, a little slice, that is really some autobiographic, information that I don't usually publish on. And I want to just say that I will put a link below of a recent interview I did where I'm starting to reveal some of my connections in thinking, not in membership and card carrying, but my interest in groups and movements like the occult, the mystical movements. The case that I'm talking about with the link below is Fear Talk number 11 I did with Steve Nation, who works with Lucis Trust out of the Alice Bailey work and archives in New York. And that was a really interesting interview, getting a chance to talk about fearlessness as a movement and the relationship with theosophy. So now you get it. My specialty, fear and fearlessness, that you probably have heard about, that I publish about regularly since 1989, and my own opening and mystical experience of why I do that. But the real connection here is that I've got a book, I've got an author, I've got a really interesting story and history that she puts together, and it's a herstory, as we'll also see, and that really is going to make for the journey of this short video. I won't make it long. Thanks for hanging in there, folks, with me. Let's go to the screen share. Takes me a moment to get all the buttons. All right, we start with nothing as the universe unfolds. Here it is. Won't go into the long story of how I became aware of this book. It really was exciting to discover in my researching because I was looking up a particular person who is one of these golden circles, black silhouetted people. And you can see it's that one there that it particularly caught my eye, and that's why I got the book, because she was one of the 5 that Lucile Scott is going to write about here. It's the story of women mysticism. That's the key term for today, and I'm going to deliberate as best I can a particular view on mysticism, how I understand it, and how my connections in the late 1970s and 80s and reading and study. So I'm talking about scholarship. I'm also talking about, sure, real experiences I've had and others that I've known. However, that's not the focus of today, is my experiences. No, that's not. I will take a little bit more intellectual approach to it all. And there's Lucile, of course, really looking very vibrant, and I'm sure she's very excited in that vibrancy that this photo captures of this new book, her first book. And I will just circle 2016, when she took this trip on hitting the rails as part of Amtrak's writer's residency program. And I thought, oh, very interesting, a traveling, mystic in her own way. And she's also somebody who goes in and out of and tells the story nicely in the book. Yes, sometimes I'm more mystical, sometimes I'm not so mystical, and well, welcome to the world. Lucile, is all of us, I think, struggle with that more or less, as did her 5 characters that she's going to arc out and write in this book. I will not go through them all, but I will name them all. So let me read what the book's about. I'm not doing a typical book review, by the way, so this is a collage, this presentation. But here's what the book editor at large, Topple Books, Jill Soloway, wrote. Just a quick note in the front of this book. When the patriarchy's suffocating grip has tightened around us, women have found a way to persist. In American Covenant, journalist Lucile Scott conjures a journey into the past, exploring the way witches, healers, and diviners have created powerful paths. So I could also write visionaries, emetics, shamans, seers have created powerful paths within creating different realities, and not just creating different realities, but tapping into them and attempting to bring them into the norm realities, the dominant, the hegemony, the oppressive as well. So this is why around 2016, she took this journey, I think is very telling when you think even historically in her life, but also historically within the life of, obviously we're talking about the American nation here, but I see the American nation in discussion here as a symptom and as a mirroring for the rest of the world. So I'm a Canadian, that's why I'm interested in it, but I'm interested in it because of the fearlessness movement I believe she's capturing a spirit of in this book. So it's a history of feminist resistance. And in 2016, of course, Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton in the US presidential election. This is a profound historical moment and has had profound, I don't have to tell everybody here and propound upon that, but worth saying, a profound effect on the history of not only the American nation. We had a woman president, potentially a lot of people thought would win and did not, and brought in a quite oppositional force of great concern, which we'll get to in a moment. So let me finish the Lucile's battles. This is from Jill's intro. Lucile's battles the oppressive heritage of patriarchal society, gathering her own historical coven of radical women who have persevered throughout the ages. And persevered, of course, and persists are words that are used here by Jill in this intro. And I would much like to say, not just persist and persevered, but led. This is a book about leadership as far as I'm concerned. So that's my academic interest. Fearlessness research is what makes a fearless leader and what happens to fearless leaders who enter into a world dominated by the rule of fear. And in this case, you could use the lens, feminist critical lens, that this is a patriarchal dominating worldview, society, culture. Overall, generalizing about culture, because there's many cultures within culture. But the idea is that these would be radical resistors that she wanted to tell the story of Lucile. And I'll just list who they are. Won't mention all of them again in this rest of this presentation. Marie Laveau. This is starting again in be the mid to late 1700s up to the 21st century, 300 years of American history and world history at the time. So Marie Laveau, Cora L.V. Scott, Helena Petrova Blavatsky, Susanna Budapest, and last not least, Marianne Williamson. The last line of the Jill's intro, Scott shatters the masculine lenses of history that have gazed upon these women and so many others. In American Covenant, heroine pass on their long legacy of courage, queerness, and defiance, inspiring us to bring our own transformational magic to the revolution. So this is what this video is about. Why is Scott's work so important to me? Well, number one, it validates the importance of understanding political history via a lens of mysticism. So you see, not just a lens of feminist criticism. It is really a much larger lens that these women that she arcs out, that I just named, arcs out how they had brought a particular lens. And I'm going to call it mysticism for the moment, but you'll see it's really spirituality. And yes, this book is definitely going to be something attractive into the hands of not only witches, diviners, healers, and not just women, but women identified and others who are in the trans categories, queer categories, of non-categories, of seers, visionaries, people who have insights, intuitions into other realms, other ways. So we'll get into that in the dominant ways. So my first coming to in the early 80s, right bright and early, and I was exploring and wanting to write and philosophy, psychology, mysticism, and all these topics. And I was a science geek, so this was really new for me, and I'll tell a little more story in a minute about why I kind of got into the esoteric or the invisible world of reality and interest, spirituality, mysticism. Ken Wilber here, just to show briefly, is really one of the integral philosophers I've been very attracted to, because he took an approach to science. He was trained in sciences himself, and then he went into East-West studies. Long story, but he's very, very famous generally around the world, has in the last 35 plus years of publishing. And he taught me that, science and spirituality go together. Number two, validates the importance of women. So thanks to this book by Lucile, we get women, trans, queer, non-conforming, and conforming, but these are people in leading in politics. They want to lead, did lead historically, and still want to lead today. And Marianne Williamson is one of those. The book validates an emancipatory methodology of revolution. This is really intriguing to me, and my wife and I have been talking about it. This notion of covenanting. So Lucile really has brought together this group of women in history. And, I say women again, always understanding that maybe women identified in and maybe other than women identified in other interesting and diverse categories of being. Many-sided spirits, you could call them perhaps, creating new myths. So this gathering is what Lucile was doing in this research she did for the book, which is really impressive, I think, and brought together women who present new myths to the world, new possibilities of reality. So they're philosophers, they're thinkers, they're mediums, some cases, they're psychic, yes, they have amazing skills and capacities. But I want to point out this is not new research. So bringing a coven together is something also my wife has done, Barbara Bickle, my life partner as well. She's a scholar in her own right, and she's just written this book, a little advertising here for it, Art, Ritual, and Trans Inquiry, which is she brings new methodologies. And I think this is exactly what, as I say, an emancipatory methodology for revelation is what Lucile's book also brings. And there's others, Scott, like Paul Ganallan, who Barbara Bickle, my partner, is also very interested in reading and studying. She gathered stories of the grandmothers of the light in a book. And this is really medicine for women. So won't go on about that methodology, but thank you very much, Lucile, for bringing that forward as, again, a methodology for all people. How do we create our own history and gather our own coven, which is a collective, in other words, for this new myth making. And the fourth one really is the serious one that drew me to get this book, draw into it, draw it out, and sharing it and promoting it in the best ways I can. Validates my working on the latest book of Marianne Williamson, Presidential Phenomenon, that I've just written, sent to the publisher just the other day. It will be out hopefully in a few weeks on the press line, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And you can see I'm interested in the phenomenon that Marianne Williamson, which validates Marianne Williamson's role in political history, leadership, presidential politics at a very critical and dangerous time. So thank you, Lucile. She just validated that. I said, oh, somebody else has recognized, and there she is. This is the silhouette of Marianne in the bottom on Lucile's book. So this was really validating for me because I did not see this when I was doing the research on my book. And here's a picture of Marianne Williamson on the cover of Vanity magazine in 1992. Not perhaps a picture that Marianne wishes that she had posed for, in that, of course, she posed probably many postures, and Vanity editor, of course, would have chosen the one they wanted for the cover. But it was a first major spread in a public, Vanity magazine, a pretty widespread, right, a market, not just the occult by any means. And it was to really say, this is a woman to watch out for. She is a mover, teacher, shaker, healer, and many other things. And not only that, she was very interested in politics. And by 1997, so 5 years after this photo was taken, Marianne would probably not have chosen this position. She would be standing, no doubt, and very fervent leader in a political revolution, which she called basically the blossoming of a new renaissance in America. All right, well, let's get to some of my interests now. I'm going to go back to the early 1979, and I'm going to be talking about the visible and the invisible world in my autobiography. So briefly, this is really how I came to see different perspectives, and call them, again, all the kinds of labels that you wish. I'm going to call them, in a more scientific, perhaps even more masculine way, I'm going to call them post-rational thought, integral thinking, vision, logic. These are not made up terms that I've made up. These are terms that are out in the literature, can be sourced out and come out of very, acute and critical minds, Ken Wilber being one of them who I mentioned. But let's go to the book by Lyle Watson. I picked up in 1979. I was just looking at it the other night, and he's the author of Supernature, became very famous. Well, who is Lyle Watson? Well, he happens to be a biologist, but he also thinks artistically, and I also think artistically, and he thinks mystically. And he had experiences, and his research in biology discovers, as a biologist, as a really important scholar in his own right, he was finding these really interesting connections between aesthetics, science, the occult, the invisible world. The mystery is another way to talk about everything that I'm talking about, and what Lucile Scott's talking about, this mystery or spirit that exists in evolution. And so thanks to that new biology, there was many books. Guy Murchie was another author, The Great Mysteries of Life, I think the book was called. And I was purchasing these just right after my long 4 or 5 years of degrees in sciences and environmental ecology and so on. And, I was obviously snooping now, something more, right? I was snooping for something more. At the time, I didn't know it was called post-rational integral thinking, vision, logic that I was searching for. My rational mind was being pushed to include, and actually it's an imperative to go beyond the rational. Anyway, in this front cover, front page of Lyle Watson's book, he has a citation by Carl J. Jung, who's a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, trained in medical doctor and so on, out of the Freudian camp, but split off from Freud, again, because of Jung's interest in spirit and the spirit world, however you want to call it again, the occult, the esoteric, mysticism, and trance as altered states of consciousness. The brink of the world, here is what he quotes from Jung. I thought, from a biologist, this is very interesting to quote Jung. I had the feeling that I had pushed to the brink of the world. What was of burning interest to me was null and void for others, the conventional, and even a cause of dread and fear. So I start to get interesting. What's this fear about? And Carl Jung said the same thing. Dread of what? I could find no explanation for this. After all, there was nothing preposterous or world-shaking in the idea that there might be events which overstep the limited categories of space, time, and causal reality. Well, many years after, again, this is this late 70s when I was interested in this material. Of course, a few years after, the new physics came out, and many of the physicists, very esteemed ones, Ettinger, David Bohm, and others, and they began to write into the 80s, particularly in the 90s as well, of the consciousness and physics and how they're related. The world of the metaphysical, the supernatural, paranormal, call it what you will, and how it relates to the physical world, reality. And again, these are scientists trained. These are not, quote, people on the margins, or wackos, whatever you want to call them, horrible names for people who think differently than the norm. But consciousness studies arose in the 1980s, and I'm just going to list a few of the people that really intrigued me. And one of them was John Curtis Gowan, and here's a book called Trance, Art, and Creativity that he wrote in the mid-70s. He also wrote one that I was purchasing these and reading them like crazy, The Psychedelic Individual. And he really was synthesizing as an integral vision logic thinker how creativity and psychedelia as experiencing and as phenomena are related to. And that was interested in the levels of higher creativity with Abraham Maslow, the more famous transpersonal psychology, humanistic psychologist in the States. And even in Russia and other countries, there were other, scientists, psychologists, and others very interested in the higher reaches of creativity. And that was really my interest at the time. I was teaching a lot on creativity just in my own workshops and studying, and very interested in that transition of creativity and mysticism and the psychedelic, the altered experiences. And I'm not just talking about psychotropic or drug-induced experiences of the 60s and 70s in terms of psychedelia and psychedelic experience, but much broader that. And these are scholars like John Curtis Gowan. Then there was Ken Wilber, dipping into mysticism deeply as he made the distinction between exoteric and esoteric dimensions of reality. And folks, we ought not to confuse them. Often the religions of the world, the great traditions of religion, but are even also of science, they have their exoteric tradition, which is kind of more mainstream. It's the less radical stream. And then within that are, the anomalies, right, that occur within the mainstream paradigms. This is what Thomas Kuhn talked about in the history of paradigm shifts within sciences, but also you can look within religions. Paradigm shifts take place of whole new transformations of worldview because of people's thought, because of their experiences, and sometimes there's openings for that thinking, for the esoteric dimension, this mystical tradition, just like within, Islam, for example, you have the mystical Kabbalah traditions, same within Christianity, all the major religions and so on. And then Rudolf Steiner, I have to mention him because he had a great effect on me. Well, how did I discover Rudolf Steiner? Again, 19th, early 20th century thinker, philosopher. He's a mystic and multiple Renaissance type of person who, because of Waldorf education, which he had been inspiring, this new kind of education. And so I was an educator at the time of the early, late 70s, early 80s, and was a school teacher at the time, trained. I was reading this kind of stuff on the side. This is curriculum. Waldorf Education is a beautiful arts-based, mystical educational philosophy. Blunt, and it's many other things than that. And he split off from the Theosophists, who I'd mentioned earlier, with Madame Blavatsky being one of the leaders of that movement, which Lucile covers in her book as one of the mystical feminists. Okay, so I think it's time to stop share. Hi. So now to the book, a little bit of reading as I'll wind up the video. So just plucked out a few things. Let's see. So I'm just going to read a little passage. This is on, Scott, Cora L.V. Scott. This again coming out of the 1800s, mid 1800s, post-Civil War period. Cora L.V. Scott being a very powerful spiritual feminist mystic, member of the leading occult, and became very involved in political action. And that's one of the things that you get from this book. Thank you. Nicely drawn together, I think, Lucile, and how you brought together how, as Marianne Williamson actually talks about a lot too, is that these feminist mystics, these seers, visionaries, even though they were having these powerful spiritual experiences and seances and so on, were very popular at the time in American history in the early 19th century, mid-19th century, but they were very involved in the progressive political movements as well, abolitionists, civil rights, women's rights, and anti-poverty campaigns and so on. Okay, so here's just a piece of writing, gives you a little bit of sense of Lucile's writing and style, which I think she nicely knits the past, the present, the future together, or what I like to refer to in integral thought as the proleptic. The thing about a great falling apart, remember this Civil War is pretty much rack and ruined America at the time, but Lucile here is talking really in a biographical sense of her own journey as well. The thing about a great falling apart is, no matter how complete the destruction, it can provide the chance to build something new, and potentially better from the rubble, a phoenix. But if, and only if, someone does the hard work of actually restructuring instead of just desperately trying to glue the pieces back together. Before long, I turned away from the mystic. So she had some early mystical experiences. She talks about them in the book. She also had some very challenging turmoil of what she calls the ghostly memories of abuse, had started hurling hatchets into my gray matter pretty constantly. My strategy reverted, don't look. Yes, this is the shadow side, right? In nations, whole psychic nations, or the psyche of a nation, and the political leaders can also get involved. The exoteric institutions get involved in don't look at that which is the shadow, which is the ugly, dirty past, the harm, the slavery, which would be the classic example of the beginning of American, and not only slavery, but the pretty much genocidal attack on the indigenous peoples of the land, so-called America. So it turns out that the thing about the shadows locked in your basement is they're fucking scary. And it's hard to delve too deeply into your mind to touch the divine without unlocking such demon cages. This is really a powerful statement, in a very wise, and I think you can hear Lucile. She's very humble in the book in many ways. She's also very saucy and sassy and somewhat badass at times, but she's quite willing to teach. And that's what you can hear her teaching about psychological realities, transformational change realities, and, quite confidently, and good for her. It is hard to delve too deeply, she says, into your mind, to touch the divine without unlocking such demons' cages. Pretty much the spiritual journey, the mystical journey, the journey into this occult world, the invisible world, as I said, at a psychological, spiritual, psychological, and political level is going to be an arising also of facing the demons. You know, there's the great teaching, I don't know where the source exactly was, in Buddhist teaching of having to work really hard to get enlightened. Discipline, you know, meditation practice, reading the Dharma, practicing community, love, compassion. And then there's the short circuit way. So it's kind of a little bit of a joke, I suppose, that, well, there's another way. You can go the short way. And that is to instant enlightenment. Instant enlightenment, other than going to a weekend workshop and thinking you're going to get an instant enlightenment of through meditation or mindfulness practice or whatever, you can get into this instant enlightenment. And so the master teacher says to the student who was quite anxious for this instant enlightenment, he said, okay, we'll go ahead. You know, we're going to meet tomorrow. There's a ritual up on the hill, so I'll meet you up there. There'll be a few others, initiates, who are going to, you know, take this journey, and I'm willing to, you know, be your guide. And so they get in the morning, and so the story goes, they get to the top of the mountain, they gather. The old master Buddhist monk says, okay, here's how it works. You're going to enter this room here. And it's a room, when you open the handle, and they looked, and it just looked like a ordinary, you know, room, tent, cabin, or whatever the situation was. Physically, I don't know. Imagine it in your mind just now anyway. So in the imagination, you can imagine, okay, he says, you're going to open the door, the handle facing you. You're going to walk in, close the door. It's going to be completely black, and there's no door handle on the inside. And inside there, of course, the young monks, the initiates, wanting this instant enlightenment, were, you know, quite disturbed and wondering, okay, what's going on here? I don't know, this sounds really too much. And then, of course, the old monk adds a little bit extra. He says, well, everything inside that dark room with no door handle on is in the black. Everything that has ever haunted you, that has ever haunted the world, the demons, so-called, the shadows, to be more psychological in language of the Jungian tradition, are all going to visit you. And that is pretty much the demons in the cage phrase that Lucile has in her book here. And that they're going to visit you, and it's going to be how you handle them that will help you. And of course, the young monks then, as the story goes, how do we, you know, get through all that? And he says, well, you know, use your meditation practice or whatever. He said, but keep your feet moving. And there's a little bit of a grin and smile on the old master when he said that. And he says, because there is a door on the other side of the room. Keep your feet moving. Now I'm going to just talk briefly about, because again, this is not a typical book review, as I said, coming near the end of this video presentation today. I want to celebrate her as a writer, Lucile. Again, new book. It's not that she's not an inexperienced writer. She obviously has learned the craft, you know, quite well, even though I would say she's relatively quite young in her career as a writer. She says, this is where I think she's quite brilliant at times. And there's several places in the book I'm reading along. Sometimes I find her writing a bit, and I don't always understand a lot of the terms. She uses quite big literary language or stuff that I certainly is beyond my reading. Of course, I could always look it up. But in a certain poignant moment, she just like cuts right through and quite artistic, beautiful. And some of her reviewers I've looked online think so. So here's just one example I'll read today of what I'd say is a literary, poetic, beautiful, psychologically acute, philosophical line. I felt stuck inside myself, but like I was looking out from a relatively geologically stable cave by this time, not the lip of a chasm. I was drinking way too much. I don't know if you got it, but there's the beautiful connection between not the lip of chasm. This time was I looking at but I was drinking too much. The addiction and the abyss of addictions. And I think, I don't think it's just, I think it's pretty clear in many authors and people. I'm sure Lucile's read some of these people, Anne Wilson Shea, for example, you know, The Addicted Society, that we are, and that we will all struggle with those addictions. So just wanted to mention that at the end, so these 5 women she covers, she has 3 chapters for each woman. And I haven't read the Marianne Williamson section other than just a little bit as a scattering. And it was, you know, interesting to read. I'm just going to give you a sense of Lucile's historical knitting acuity to connect patterns. But under new Marianne Williamson, who ran for the presidential Democratic leadership in 2019, dropped out early, of course. And that's the book that I've just written on, trying to study that whole phenomenon. What happened? You know, what was this great arising of a mystic, feminist mystic or resistor in the American election? And then what happened, right? What is the demons that both in her and arguably both in her historical past and the connections of history with when feminists arising, a new gaze, a new mysticism, a new occult, a new esoteric view attempts to come into the mainstream. And so that's what my book's about. Hopefully you'll take a check on that when it comes out, and love to hear about your views. But first chapter on Marianne Williamson, she calls The New Age of what exactly? So she kind of lists Marianne Williamson part 5 as New Age sage and presidential candidate. Pretty blunt. Thanks for saying that, because my book goes into that in some fine details on chapters on the Marianne Williamson phenomenon, in contrast to the Donald Trump phenomenon. But it's much bigger than those two. But anyways, I wanted to just say that here's the kind of historical acuity, or just maybe intuitive smartness of what I see in Lucile's writing at times. It shows out more than just what I'm reading here, but I want to give one example. This is how she starts the second paragraph on this Marianne Williamson section. On the 176th anniversary of the first reading of the Declaration of Independence, July 8th, 1952, Marianne was born in Texas to Sophie Ann and Sam Williamson. Blah, 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 blah. I thought, that's great, you know, nice piece of writing and research there. Again, making history really alive and embodying historical time. So instead of just saying, you know, Marianne Williamson was born on July 8th, 1952, blah, blah, blah. She starts the sentence on the 176th anniversary of the first reading of the Declaration of Independence. That is so meaningful on many levels, because when you actually listen to Marianne Williamson, read her work, she is so into, mega into the founding fathers, the Declaration of Independence, of course, of the American states from Britain, the oppressor, right, the old world and the new world, and the excitement of what the new Constitution. So Marianne Williamson is a big constitutional historian, and she advocates for historical education. This is something, I think Marianne's many things, and oh my God, she's incredibly complex. Again, my book covers many of that. I'm sure Lucile will touch on that complexity, as with all the other 4 feminist mystic women in the book. And that's really the goal, is they are complex. They're not simple. They're not just witches. They're not just healers. They're not just psychics or wackos, whatever the woo-woo aspect that might be focused on by certain shallow interpretations. In a deep reading and historical reading, this is the kind of history. Marianne Williamson is totally an advocate for a new history, a revisionist history, and that not just in a radical postmodern kind of post-structural way. No, that's not Marianne. She's not scholarly in that kind of way, and not up on the latest post-structural, postmodern revisionist histories. She's interested in, obviously, that we construct history and that we ought to take responsible for that construction. So that's kind of a postmodern, post-formal and an integral kind of thinking sense. But she is also traditional in a certain kind of way that we ought to still respect history. And I think Lucile, again, being, probably Gen Y hair type of individual, is, also saying, I'm going to put it right down. Declaration of Independence since July 8th, 1952. It's an important date. So young persons reading her book, Lucile's book, would immediately get how important real history, and there is some real history, there is some facts, and of course, everything can be interpreted as multiple readings. So I like how Lucile really respects, to me, in that connection she made with Marianne's birth, to how Marianne is really a spirit of a new history, arising, and has been arising for decades. This is nothing new to Marianne. You'll see it in all her work and her biographies. So I think my voice is going. Thank you very much for listening today. Look forward to your comments.